Well, greetings and welcome to this lecture on the provenance of historical objects. Really, it's about cultural heritage, provenance, and repatriation. So, those are terms that you may not be familiar with right now, but hopefully by the end of this lecture, you'll know exactly what those are. And I'm going to just dig right into the content. This is in preparation for your virtual field trip to the Carlos Museum at Emory University. I hope that some of you will actually venture down. There's an extra credit assignment where if you and you can form a group and go, you can go individually, whatever you guys want to do, and you do get a little bit of kickback for that. So, but everyone has to do the virtual field trip, and so that's why we're looking at museum studies and provenance today. All right, so let's dig in. So, how might the study of ancient objects enhance our understanding of cultural heritage? Well, I think some of that's a little bit obvious and maybe a little obscure in some ways as well. So, if you're looking at ancient objects, you're looking at real things from real people. It's a real time and place. And these people, we tend to look at this historically as very separate from us because maybe it was 2,000 years ago, the piece that you're looking at, or it could be even 100 years ago, and it still feels very far away, very distant from us. However, we have to remember that these are real people who lived real lives, and that's where cultural heritage comes into play. So, cultural heritage constitutes an integral part of the identity of every nation. Cultural heritage is not just a boring historical study. It reveals how people historically thought about themselves and about others. It reveals their religion, their social structure, their economic standing. There's so much that can be learned from looking at an object. And it also reveals shared bonds. Everyone is human all through time. We all have shared threads of humanity. And when we look at these things, we can see our humanity in these objects. And so we tend to look at items in museums as artifacts. I prefer the word objects because I think artifact makes it sort of sterile. And we really want to connect with these people in a very unique and special way. And so throughout this presentation, I might say the word artifact every once in a while, but usually I'll use the term object. So, how should we protect cultural heritage? And there's a question of if we should repatriate. So, repatriation refers to returning an object to its home country. And what you see here is on Easter Island. And these statues are well known. They're used as screensavers for your laptops and things like that. But they're very relevant to the people who lived on Easter Island. They show worship, they show leadership, political structure. And so, there's a real question of should these things be left in their home countries or should we put them in museums? Because both really have value. And a lot of people are not going to travel to these distant places to see these things. I have never been to Easter Island. I'm not sure if you have. I would love to go one day, but there are many places in the world that I've never been. And we live one life. We have so many resources, and the odds are we're not going to go to every foreign country that there is to see these things. And so it's nice to have them in a museum where we can learn firsthand about cultures and things like that. However, there is a real question of how ethical that actually is, and you'll kind of see why as I present this lecture. So, what is provenance? Provenance refers to the history of an object. So, it's a record of ownership of a work of art or an antique. It's typically used as a guide for authenticity or quality. So, in other words, once the object was removed from the mother country, where did it go? Where did it go next and next and next? And can we create like a file for this object so that we know, okay, there was an archaeologist and he excavated such and such, and he was able to make a deal, let's just say with Egypt, and he took he bought this mummy from the Egyptian government, and he took this mummy back to the United States, where it was sold on auction to a collector, and the collector had it for a while, but then it really didn't suit his motif, or maybe he had it boxed up or whatever. And so then he sells it to a museum, and then that museum barters it for some other object or whatever. And you can see like you can really go down the line with this stuff. And it's very important to understand the provenance of an object because that's how you know it wasn't stolen art. And so that kind of gets us into I don't know if you've ever seen the show White Collar. I really like that show, although there's a lot of plot holes in it and things like that. You may be rolling your eyes like, oh, I hate that show or whatever. But there's some truth to it, you know, that art thievery is a real thing. And I'm going to talk today about some actual people who sold art on the black market and how they did it. Why? And obviously it's wrong, but I mean, why is it wrong culturally? Like it's obviously wrong to steal. I think that's just sort of a natural law written on the heart, right? But why really? Like what is the deal with cultural heritage and why does that add another level to it? And so we'll talk about that as well. So provenance is important because we can see if the object is historically significant. So what did it see in its lifetime? It affects the market value. There's a pedigree to the objects. It adds cachet or prestige. It increases the market value if it has a solid provenance. There's a lesser chance of repatriation later because some countries will ask for stolen loot back. And you can verify the authenticity and attribution of an object. You can ensure good title. And that's probably the most important thing if you're working in a museum. You want to have a reputable museum with a reputable collection. And if you have a bunch of stolen items in your museum, previously stolen items, that doesn't look so good, right? And so those are just some of the reasons provenance is important. Now, how is provenance research done? Well, first, you want to examine the artwork, look for markings or stickers. If the object has been in a museum before, it may have a barcode on it or it'll have something, that shows where it's been. It might have a file. If it, like I said, you want to put together a file for all these items. Some museums have already done that. And so that makes it pretty easy for those who are looking to buy and whatnot. You can look at auction catalogs and site reports. There's so much available online today that it makes it rather easy. You can also look for trends like certain items are prone to looting, sort of like the Palmyra portraits, which I'll talk about. And so, if it's a Palmyra portrait, you might want to look right away. There's also items from Baghdad that were known to be looted. And so if it's a Iraqi piece, you might want to check into that. So you can contact any previous museums where the item was housed. You can talk about what types of objects are prone to looting. And note, gaps do not automatically mean that the object was stolen. So just because, let's say you have a 20-year span that you have no idea where this item was, that doesn't necessarily mean it was a looted good. Sometimes it's just impossible to construct the entire history, just like other histories of other things, right? And the final thing is you really want to look at the cultural patrimony laws in the source country, including export regulations. And so this is going to be a very legislative presentation just to kind of fill you in on how this works. But it's also going to be very informative, I think, engaging, lots of history and legislation all tied into one here. So the issue of provenance and repatriation is one of the most important issues facing Western museums today. As museums in the Western world face increasing requests from foreign governments for the return of cultural patrimony, they must work to develop a mutual understanding and respect for the rights of source countries to be able to protect their own cultural heritage. And so, in other words, if the item is from Rome or Greece, does that mean we have a responsibility to return it if the governments ask for it? And there's not an easy yes or no answer to that question. And so the United Nations has a group, it's United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, which is a mouthful, but it computes to UNESCO, which you've probably heard of UNESCO, I'm guessing. If not, take a look at them. They do a lot of very important work related to all of these things. They have cultural heritage sites that they have designated, almost like we have federal parks in America and state parks. Like UNESCO has these cultural heritage sites that are protected. And so most of the legislation that we have about provenance, repatriation, and all of that, protection of cultural heritage, comes from the 1970 Convention for UNESCO. It set the standard for legislation across the globe, but each individual nation has their own set of laws. And so the UNESCO laws don't trump the state laws, at least at this point. But the states have varying laws, and some of them are more specific than others. So this examines objects as cultural property, and it explains the importance of protection of cultural heritage. The main issue addressed is the illegal import and export of items as related to cultural heritage. So, federal law on archaeological, artistic, and historical monuments and zones. This, of course, is a United States law. The legislation protects movable cultural objects from Mexico. So, this is specifically only objects from Mexico. They cannot be bought and sold. Rather, the objects must be listed in an archaeological database, and the National Institute of Anthropology and History, the INAH, which you may have heard of, is responsible for the preservation and conservation of items. So if the item doesn't fall within a description presented in the legislation, it can be dealt with on an individual basis. Okay, so that covers an American law. Here's another American law, NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. This one is extremely significant, especially in the state where I live, because we have a number of Native American mounds. And so the mounds museums, which I'll show you a picture at the end, I actually do a lot of work with Etowah Indian mounds and New Echota as well. And so what's happened is based on NAGPRA, a lot of items have already been repatriated because it's a Graves Protection Act, which means if it's a funerary item, it has to be returned. And so what you're seeing in mounds museums all across the country is that basically the whole museum has been returned to the Native American tribes. And that is very significant. For a time, the cases were empty. And I'm sorry, I don't have a new picture to show you. I was up there for a meeting just about a month and a half ago, and they put up some really nice boards, and they've got a few artifacts back. But really, or I should say objects, right? Follow my own rule here, objects. But overall, they don't have a whole lot to show outside of the mounds, and everything is sort of just like boards of information because these items have been returned. And I actually contacted a representative from the Muskogee Creeks. I spoke with him at length for a paper I was writing for my doctoral degree, and they were thrilled to have them back. And I asked him specifically if he wanted the mounds back. And there's some talk of that. I think it's just talk, but you can get on. There are some websites on the American government website where they have dialogue with representatives from the Native American tribes, not just the Creeks, but all of them. And you can read through this dialogue and kind of get a feel for what the requests are from the Native Americans that are being made and how those requests are being granted. And so I'll try to add a link to that so you guys can take a look at it if you want to read more. But very fascinating, very interesting things happening with the mounds museums all across America. And it's all related to NAGPRA. So NAGPRA is an extension of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. That's ARFA. And it applies to federally recognized tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, religion, science, land, history, and the relationship of Native communities. So any organization that has received federal funds must comply with NAGPRA. NAGPRA is very tied to land, and it all applies to federal and tribal lands. So there are two laws for you from America. Let's talk about England. What are England's laws? Well, theirs are kind of dated. They have this British Museum Act of 1932. And this legislation prohibits the return of an item of antiquity unless it fits into certain categories such as being damaged or a duplicate. And so they basically do not allow repatriation, right? At the time it was passed in 1932, the cultural climate was very different. And that's one reason for dispute over the Elgin marbles. And so you can call it Elgin or Elgin. I believe in Britain they call it Elgin marbles. It was Lord Elgin who found it. But the Elgin marbles is a collection of stone sculptures and inscriptions, more properly known as the Parthenon sculptures. They were acquired by Lord Elgin in Athens, Greece between 1801 and 1805. And today they live in London's British Museum. You can see them in the photo here. And so there's a long controversy. I had to write a paper about this for my undergraduate degree. So that's how popular this topic is. But the Elgin marbles represent one of the longest running controversies in the British Museum's history. The museum holds 15 metopes, 17 penamental figures, and a 247-foot section of decorative frieze, all of which are believed to have been crafted between 447 and 432 BC, which you can see part of that here. So there's a real question before I move on to the Moravian manuscripts. There's a real question here of should the British Museum repatriate? And you know, when I wrote my paper for my undergraduate degree, I had to answer that question. You know, did I think ethically they had a responsibility to do that? And honestly, it's been so long ago, I can't remember what I said because that was like 15, almost 20 years ago. And I won't try to answer that question for you here. I would like just to give you the factual information and you guys can make up your own mind. And that's really what this assignment is about. You know, what is your stance on cultural heritage, on repatriation of goods? Yes or no? And so that brings us to the Moravian manuscripts. And so the idea here is that Moravian missionaries from Germany went to Sweden. They did missionary work as missionaries do, right? And so a lot of documents, a lot of records were done during this time. And those records are kept by the Swedish people. So, should the Swedish people repatriate these records to the Moravian home place in Germany? And you know, there are definitely two sides of the aisle. You know, in a way, this is one of the most convoluted examples because it's Swedish history just as it is Moravian history. And so, you know, you can make copies. Each group can have a copy, but who gets the originals? And that's the questions. So you also have the International Institute for Unification of Private Law. This is the 1995 convention. And so the organization is based out of Rome, Italy, and was established in 1926 as part of the League of Nations. And the legislation from the 1995 convention states that proof of illegal or underboard activity must be presented in order for an item to be repatriated. So there's no illegal or underboard activity that we know of that went on in the case with Sweden and the Moravians. So, you know, if you're going that route, there wouldn't be a need to repatriate. And this is where the legislation gets a little tricky, right? So, you know, should we have to prove that the goods are looted or not? I mean, what is the plumb line for repatriation? How far do we go? Is it based on cultural heritage or is it based on underboard activity? And you can kind of see with this law how that gets a little convoluted. So there is in Italy a museum of rescued art. You can take a virtual tour online. It's rather fun. But the Museum for Rescued Art was opened in June of 2022 for the purpose of displaying items that have been repatriated to Italy. Just about all of these were stolen, sold on the black market, or in some cases, they were sold right in plain sight through places like Sotheby's in London because they made false papers to try to prove that these are legit items. And the papers were so great that they weren't even noticed. And that's how they came to be. Like the Carlos Museum had 5 items like this. The Metropolitan Museum of Art is known for these things as well. And it was very clandestine, this program that they had, which I'll kind of show you. So in August of 2023, a transfer of 5 items from the Carlos to Italy occurred. One of these was the Volute crater. It was acquired in 1994 from a collector named Pierre Chalounov. And you can see the crater here. He had purchased it from a Swiss art market in the 1960s, and at the time it was acquired, it was a well-known piece. Articles had been published about it, and it was considered a really good purchase. This was before the museums really understood the depth and breadth of antiquities looting. So this is me. I have trained as a docent at the Carlos Museum. I made a series of videos for my class on Western civilization. And so and this was actually from that video series that I shot. And here I am talking about red figure pottery and standing next to the infamous Volute crater. So you can kind of get a feel for how large it is. But here's the backstory, okay? So Giacomo Medici was part of a group of known robbers. They would funnel objects through various dealers and auction houses, and they were typically purchased by museums and private collectors. Medici actively looted and sold art for over 40 years. He was exposed by James Hodges, who was convicted of stealing antiquities and money from his employer, and he stole documents and made copies of them. These copies were eventually used as leverage. So you can see here, this is Pasquale Camera is another one. He's known as the fat guy. So you can imagine why he got that nickname. But he was lieutenant in the 1960s with the Customs Police. I shouldn't say these things, that's not nice. But this allowed him to profit from the looting of antiquities, and he was suspected of stealing 8 Greek vases from a castle. So he died in an auto accident on August 31st, 1995. And that was when the police found Polaroid photographs in his car, which led to the raid on his apartment. And this eventually led them to Medici, who was also arrested in 1997, sentenced in 2004. And this is one of the first times that they were able to map out art thieving activity. And so you can see here, obviously, he's got some pretty questionable vases and things. The way that they're stored looks questionable. Just everything that they discovered in his car just kind of led them to investigate, and they were able to get to the bottom of some things. So Gianfranco Bacchina is a Sicilian antiquities trafficker who may have been backed by the mob. He has been dealing since the 1970s, and he had a Polaroid show up in the Pasquale Camera car. That was along with the Medici Polaroids. And so he was part of the same web as Medici. In 2002, the police seized over 6,000 objects, 8,000 photographs, and 13,000 documents that are all now known as the Bacchina Archive. If I'm not mistaken, Bacchina now sells olive oil on Amazon for $29.95. So go get you a bottle. So the value of cultural heritage. Lebanon's consul general in New York, he told the New York Times, when you steal a nation's cultural heritage, you're stealing its memory, its history, and its identity. And so clearly it's wrong to steal. But when you steal something of that sort of value, are you devaluing the people who made it? You're devaluing history, you're devaluing the culture of that country. And yes, it is going to a museum in a lot of cases. Does that make it better or worse? Right? Because all of a sudden the item can be put on display. Many people can study it and learn about the culture in a way that maybe they wouldn't. But then at the same time, the way, it's just an underboard situation. And so I encourage you, as you're writing your papers, to kind of think about that, think that through, and really come to some conclusions on your personal understanding of cultural heritage, provenance, repatriation as it relates to the looting of art. Okay, so that brings us to the Palmyra project. And Palmyra is an ancient site in Syria that was destroyed during the Civil War in 2015. They suffered looting. And Palmyra, I encourage you to watch a documentary on it. There's some really good, like 45-minute to an hour documentaries, and it's just a beautiful place, beautiful structures that are still left there. But there's been a huge uptick of trade of illegal items since 2015. And so the Palmyra Portrait Project began in 2012 at Aarhus University in Denmark, and they wanted to catalog portraits to study ancient identity. And so the project evolved after the Civil War because it was used to trace items that had been lost, stolen, or destroyed. And today it hosts about 2,500 images, and it's become a guide for provenance researchers across the globe. So the Carlos Museum does have a Palmyra, and after a lengthy process, they purchased a quantity of items in 1975. It became known as the Ricard Collection because they got it from a man whose last name was Ricard. And so two reliefs from Palmyra were included in the collection, and they had no provenance information. So remember what I said at the beginning, if an object is known for being a looted good, you've got to really check into it. And so they were very concerned about these Palmyras. Now, the Carlos Museum Associates were able to locate the lady from the Ricard database, or in the database. Her number is PS652. She was previously in the collection of Emile Bertone, who worked at Palmyra in the 1890s. She was sold at auction in 1931, and they were able to locate archival paperwork from the sale. They discovered that she had lost her nose at some point, so the nose had the one that's currently on display had been reconstructed. And so this was a win in several ways because the Carlos accepted the item with no provenance information, and they were able to fill the gap for the Palmyra Project, who was actually looking for information on that particular piece. Another very prominent piece is the Egyptian boat. This has been front and center on the AJC and all sorts of publications. And so they did a scan, they did a CAT scan, and they realized that only this bottom part of the boat is actually authentic. Someone probably drilled holes in it and put these figures in it to make it more interesting. And that was done much later in kind of modern times. So, Baghdad. So let's talk about the Sphinx. The Sphinx ivory was broken. It had come from Iraq. It was purchased by the Carlos Museum in 2006 by funds from private donors. Provenance researcher at the Carlos, Annie Shanley, found evidence of potential looting. And so she Googled the piece with the catalog number, and it popped up on a stock photo that was taken in the Baghdad Museum. The ivory was sold to the museum by Sands of Time in Washington, D.C., and there was a written statement that Khalif provided that the item had belonged to her since 1969. Her husband brought it into the U.S. from Palestine, and she stated that she had no knowledge of it being obtained illegally. Now, how did the looting in Iraq actually happen? Here's where your history lesson sort of comes in. So, looting began in Iraq in 2003 when the National Museum of Iraq experienced its first burglary. Now, the staff had vacated the museum a few days prior because of the Persian Gulf War and the invasion of Iraq. So, if you're not familiar with Saddam Hussein and the Persian Gulf War, I'm going to go into that briefly. Feel free if you want to scroll past this, if you know all these events, that's fine, but you might want to brush up on it just a little bit. I remember watching some of these things with my dad when I was a little girl, just watching them on the news. So it brings back memories for me. But one of the major events during Bush Sr.'s presidency was the Persian Gulf War. Saddam Hussein was a Sunni Muslim who was a member of the Ba'ath Party. They formed in 1946. The word itself means Renaissance, which you know is like rebirth. And so Hussein hoped to annex Kuwait as part of Iraq. He also wanted to resurrect the biblical city of Babylon and make himself like Nebuchadnezzar of the Bible. Hussein sent Iraqi Republican Guard forces into Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990, and within 2 days it was annexed. He renamed it the 19th province of Iraq, and the UN then mandated a withdrawal from Kuwait, but Hussein threatened to attack Israel if they didn't give him the Gaza Strip. And you follow the history of the Gaza Strip, that is an infamous area with lots of contestation. And so Bush volunteered to lead the United Nations coalition of 34 countries against Iraq to free Kuwait and put an end to threats against Israel. And so other nations involved included the UK, Egypt, Qatar, France, Canada, Italy, and Australia. Now, this event became known as the Persian Gulf War or Operation Desert Storm. So after 9/11, Iraq violated the Gulf War settlement due to weapons inspections, no fly zones, and other things. And the CIA reported that they were probably making weapons of mass destruction. So this is why we invaded Iraq again in the early 2000s, and the Iraqi War lasted from 2003 to 2011. Now, the ransacking of the National Museum of Iraq is one of the worst acts of cultural vandalism in modern times, according to the University of Sydney. What happened? The staff had removed and safely stored 8,366 artifacts before the looting happened. Some 15,000 objects were removed during about 36 hours, and a number of groups were responsible for this, including people from the United Arab Emirates, the United States, and other countries. So that kind of gives you an idea. And the Carlos had that one piece, which they have since taken care of. So that brings us to the Hobby Lobby incident. So Hobby Lobby was involved with the creation of the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. And Steve Green, the president of Hobby Lobby, was very excited about the project, as anyone would when they're starting, when you're working to put together your own museum of any kind, right? And so in 2009, Hobby Lobby received a large shipment of items from the Near East, and it was seized by U.S. Customs agents. So this resulted in a case known as the United States of America versus approximately 450 ancient cuneiform tablets and approximately 3,000 ancient clay bullae. So Hobby Lobby agreed to return the artifacts and pay a fine of $3 million. Not really sure what happened there. I assume that maybe Hobby Lobby didn't do their research on legislation prior to bringing this stuff in. And this is another really great example as to why, when you're working in museum studies, you've got to know the laws of your land. Otherwise, you might accidentally break them and have a massive fine to pay for it. So, in summary, the issue of provenance and repatriation is one of the most important issues facing Western museums today. This is because we are developing a new understanding of cultural patrimony and heritage. These issues raise important questions about how to care for objects. What does it mean to care for an object? At its core, this is what a museum does, right? And again, when you're writing your paper, think about this. What does it mean to care for an object? Physical and intellectual care, that's two types. We need to physically care for it. How do we care for the cultural heritage aspects of it? Does this mean showing it here or returning it to the mother country? At this point, the Carlos Museum has been cleared of all claims against its collections. They've taken care of everything. Annie Shanley has done a fabulous job, and she says that we need more open conversations between countries, public conversation. Personally, I believe we're in a time that new legislation is on the horizon, and this is me speaking now. I think that we need researchers to begin working on projects to pave the way for thoughtful conversation about how this should go and what it should practically look like. I will add, not everybody is for repatriation. If you want the opposing view, take a look at a 2014 article by James Cuno, The Culture War, the Case Against Repatriation. And these are the pictures that I took at Etowah Indian Mound. So you can kind of see the museum's closed here, the empty shelves. And so this article by James Cuno references the work of the Italian government. It includes the Museum for Rescued Art, which I showed you photos of, and which opened in 2022. He states specifically, in the battle over cultural heritage, repatriation claims based strictly on national origin are more than just denials of cultural heritage, they are also arguments against the promise of encyclopedic museums. So there are both sides to the story. I encourage you guys to really think about this topic, check it out, and I look forward to reading your finished work and seeing your virtual field trips to the Carlos Museum and hopefully some physical trips as well. So that's it. Have a great day.